A few months after I turned 68, my son Kevin came to visit with what he called a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He looked me in the eye and said, "Mom, your savings are just sitting there losing value. Trust me with this." But it wasn't until I saw his wife's social media that I understood what he was really building. But before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. We love to know how far our stories are reaching. My name is Margaret Peterson. I'm 68 years old and I live in Madison, Wisconsin. For 40 years, I was an elementary school teacher. After my husband, Arthur, passed away, my life became very quiet. My days were simple. I'd water the ferns on my porch, do the crossword, and wait for a call from my only son, Kevin. He was the center of my world, along with my grandchildren, Liam and Olivia. So when he showed up that Sunday afternoon, I was happy to see him. He brought a folder full of charts and papers. He seemed so professional, so sure of himself. He spread the papers on my kitchen table. "Mom," he started, "this is a unique opportunity in property development funds." He said my money in the bank was worthless, just losing value. He promised that in 1 year, my savings would double. He told me it would secure my future and pay for the grandchildren's college tuition. The mention of my grandchildren was all it took. I trusted him completely. The next day, I went to the bank. I transferred $125,000 to his account. It was everything Arthur and I had ever saved. He hugged me at the door and said, "You won't regret this." That was the last time I saw him for weeks. The first few weeks were quiet. I called Kevin once, maybe twice. He always sounded busy, his voice distant through the phone. He'd say things like, "Everything's on track, Mom, don't worry." But his answers were short, clipped. He never offered any details. He never asked how I was doing. I would hang up the phone and the silence in the house would rush back in. I told myself he was just focused. He was working hard for us, for the grandchildren. I tried to believe it. I kept to my routine. I watered the ferns and did the crossword puzzle. But my mind would drift. I'd stare at the empty squares, unable to think of the words. I found myself sitting in Arthur's old armchair for hours, just looking out the window. The neighborhood felt the same, but my world had tilted slightly off its axis. A small, cold knot of unease had settled in my stomach. It was a feeling I couldn't name, but it was there when I woke up and when I went to bed. After a month, the quiet started to feel like a deliberate silence. I hadn't seen Liam or Olivia. I missed their noise, their laughter filling up the empty rooms of my house. I called and asked Kevin if I could take them out for pizza. He said they had too much homework. A week later, I called again. Tiffany answered this time. Her voice was polite but cool. She told me they were busy with soccer practice. She said, "Kevin will call you back, Margaret." He never did. That was when the loneliness began to feel different. It wasn't just the absence of Arthur anymore. It was a new kind of isolation, one that felt imposed on me. I started to question myself. I replayed that Sunday afternoon in my head, over and over. I saw the chart spread across my kitchen table. I heard his confident voice promising to double my savings. Had I been a fool? Had my love for him and the grandchildren made me blind? The thought was a sharp, physical pain. I stopped talking about the investment to my neighbors. When my friend Carol asked how it was going, I just smiled and said, "Fine, just fine." The words felt like ash in my mouth. I couldn't admit my growing fear to anyone. I couldn't bear the thought of them looking at me with pity. Arthur had always handled the finances. He was so careful, so methodical. He would have read every single line of fine print. He would have known what questions to ask. I felt like I had failed him. The feeling of shame was constant. I had worked for 40 years. I had saved every extra dollar. Arthur and I went without vacations and fancy cars to build that nest egg. It was supposed to be my security. It was my independence. Now, it was gone. And I had nothing to show for it but my son's vague promises. I would walk past the bank and feel a wave of nausea. I couldn't bring myself to look at my own reflection in the glass doors. I saw a foolish old woman. 2 months after I gave him the money, Kevin finally visited. He didn't come inside. He stood on the porch, his car still running at the curb. He didn't ask about the investment, and neither did I. Instead, he looked at my house, at the paint that was starting to peel near the windows. He said, "Mom, have you ever thought about downsizing? This place is a lot for one person to handle." The suggestion hung in the air between us, cold and heavy. His words struck me as odd and deeply unsettling. Why would he bring that up? We had just made an investment that was supposed to secure my future. Why would I need to sell my home? I looked at him, trying to see the little boy I had raised, but his eyes were distant. He looked like a stranger calculating numbers in his head. I told him no. This was my home. I wasn't going anywhere. He just nodded slowly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he smoothed it away. His visit left me deeply shaken. The small knot of unease had grown into a heavy stone of dread. I started losing sleep. I would wake up in the middle of the night, the house completely dark and silent, and the fear would be overwhelming. What had I done? Where was my money? I felt powerless. I had no documents, no contract, nothing but a bank transfer slip and a son who wouldn't look me in the eye. I was completely at his mercy. My days lost their structure. I'd forget to eat. The crossword puzzles lay unfinished on the coffee table. I stopped sitting on the porch because I didn't want to make small talk with anyone. I felt like I was hiding from my own mistake, hiding from the truth that was starting to form in the back of my mind. The truth was too ugly to face. A son doesn't do that to his own mother. I kept telling myself that, clinging to the idea like a life raft. I started looking through old photo albums, trying to find reassurance. I saw pictures of Kevin's first steps, his high school graduation, his wedding. In every picture, I was there, smiling proudly by his side. I had devoted my life to him. I had sacrificed so much. The thought that he could see me as just a resource, as a bank account to be emptied, was a betrayal so profound I couldn't fully comprehend it. It felt like a part of my past was being erased. The house, once my sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. The walls held 40 years of memories, but now they seemed to mock me. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded louder than ever, each tick marking another second of my foolishness. I would sit in the kitchen and stare at the empty chair where Kevin had sat, where he had convinced me to trust him. The memory was no longer a happy one. It was the scene of a crime. I tried calling him again a week later. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message. "Kevin, it's Mom. Please call me. I need to talk to you." My voice sounded weak and shaky, even to my own ears. I hated it. I had always been a strong person, a respected teacher. Now I was reduced to begging for a phone call from my own child. He didn't call back that day, or the next. The silence was his answer. His avoidance confirmed my worst fears. There was no investment. There was no property development fund. There was just a lie. The realization didn't come in a sudden flash, but as a slow, creeping cold that settled deep in my bones. I felt hollowed out. The money was one thing. It was my security. Yes, but the trust. He had taken my trust. He had taken my faith in the one person I thought would always protect me. That was a loss I couldn't put a number on. I felt utterly defeated. What could I do? I was a 68-year-old widow. He was my only son. If I confronted him, I would lose him and my grandchildren forever. If I did nothing, I would have to live with this silent humiliation, this knowledge that I had been discarded after I was no longer useful. Both options felt like a life sentence. I was trapped between a devastating truth and an unbearable silence. There was no good way forward. I thought about calling a lawyer, but what would I say? My son tricked me, but I have no proof. I would be a laughingstock. I imagined having to tell the story to a stranger, admitting how easily I had been deceived. The shame was paralyzing, so I did nothing. I just existed, moving through my days like a ghost in my own life. The motivation I once had for gardening, for baking, for everything, was gone. It had all been drained away. The lack of money started to become a real, practical problem. A water pipe under the kitchen sink burst. The plumber's bill was higher than I expected. I had to use my credit card, something I rarely did. I looked at my small pension check and did the math. Without my savings, a single emergency like this could become a catastrophe. The fear was no longer abstract. It was real, and it was sitting at my kitchen table with me every night. I felt a growing anger, but it had nowhere to go. It just churned inside me, making me bitter. I found myself getting irritated over small things. I was short with the cashier at the grocery store. I snapped at a telemarketer. This wasn't me. I had always been patient, kind. The betrayal was changing me, twisting me into someone I didn't recognize. I was becoming as cold and hard as the feeling in my chest. One afternoon, my neighbor Carol stopped by. She found me sitting in the living room, just staring at a blank television screen. She could tell something was wrong. She was a kind soul, much younger than me, and always trying to cheer me up. She sat down with her phone. "You need a distraction, Margaret," she said gently. "Let's look at some funny pictures online. It always helps me when I'm feeling down." I just nodded, too tired to argue. She started scrolling through her social media feed, showing me pictures of cats and local events. Then she paused. "Oh, look, it's your daughter-in-law, Tiffany. She's always posting something fabulous." Carol turned the phone toward me. My heart stopped. It was a picture of Tiffany and Kevin, standing on a large plot of land. They were beaming, holding a sign that said, "Future home of the Peterson family." It was dated 2 months ago, just a week after I gave him the money. Carol kept scrolling, not noticing the change in me. The next photo was of a concrete foundation being poured, then another of wooden frames going up, the skeleton of a large, expensive-looking house. There were a dozen pictures, a whole album documenting the construction. Tiffany had written captions on each one, "Making our dreams a reality, one brick at a time," and "So grateful for my amazing husband who makes it all possible." I stared at the images on the small screen, the bright, happy photos of their new life, their dream house, my dream, my security, my husband's hard work. It was all there, being turned into 2x4s and drywall. I could see the address of the gated community geotagged on one of the posts. It was a wealthy suburb, a place I could never afford to even visit. The world seemed to go silent around me. Carol was still talking, but I couldn't hear her words. All I could see was the smiling face of my son, standing on the foundation of his new life, a life built on top of the ruins of mine. The savings passbook Arthur had given me, now empty, flashed in my mind. Every brick in that house was a piece of my past, a piece of my future. There was no investment. There was only this. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was a photograph. It was a public announcement for the whole world to see. And in that moment, seeing the proof, I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt nothing at all. Just a profound, chilling emptiness. I was completely and utterly trapped. He had taken everything, and he was so proud of it. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no clear way out. After Carol left, the house was silent again. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the empty, lonely quiet I had grown used to. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with the images from Tiffany's social media. I saw my son's smiling face, the wooden frame of his new house, the caption about dreams coming true. The pictures were burned into my mind. I sat in Arthur's armchair for hours, not moving, just staring at the wall. The emptiness I felt wasn't sadness. It was a cold, hollow space where my trust used to be. The betrayal was no longer a fear. It was a fact, documented in high-resolution photos for the world to see. The next few days passed in a blur of mechanical actions. I made my bed. I washed the dishes. I watered the ferns on the porch. But I was just a body going through the motions. My mind was a million miles away, standing on that plot of land, watching them build a house with the bricks of my life. I couldn't bring myself to do the crossword puzzle. The words wouldn't come. How could I think of simple answers when the biggest question of my life had been answered in such a cruel, public way? I felt like a ghost in my own home, haunted by the digital proof of my own foolishness. I stopped answering the phone when it rang. I didn't want to talk to Carol or any of my neighbors. What could I possibly say? The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest and making it hard to breathe. I took the photo albums off the shelf, the ones filled with pictures of Kevin growing up. I looked at his innocent face as a child, his proud smile at graduation. I had to close them. The person in those pictures was gone, or maybe he had never existed at all. I was mourning a son who was still alive, and that felt like the loneliest grief in the world. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The seasons began to change outside my window, but inside, everything was frozen. I imagined the construction on their house was continuing. I pictured them picking out paint colors and kitchen cabinets, spending my security, my future, on trivial details. The anger that had been simmering inside me began to cool, hardening into something else. It was a quiet, cold resolve. The shock had worn off, the grief had subsided, and what was left was a strange sense of clarity. I finally saw my son not as the child I had raised, but as the man he had become. One afternoon, the phone rang, and for some reason, I answered it. It was him. "Mom?" Kevin's voice sounded strained, different from the cheerful, confident tone he used when he asked for the money. There was an edge of desperation to it now. He asked how I was, his words sounding rehearsed and hollow. I didn't play along. I just said, "I'm fine, Kevin. What do you want?" The silence on the other end of the line was telling. He was surprised by my directness, my lack of warmth. He finally said he needed to come over, to talk about something important. My heart started pounding, but it wasn't from fear. It was a different feeling, a readiness. I knew this was it. This was the next chapter of his manipulation. I agreed, my voice steady. "Fine. Come tomorrow at 3. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, my hands perfectly still. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a victim waiting for the next blow to fall. I felt like I was preparing for a battle, a quiet one that would be fought right here, in my own living room. The next day, I didn't bake or clean in anticipation of his visit. I just sat and waited. I wore a simple dress, the one Arthur always liked. I felt I needed his strength with me. When the doorbell rang at exactly 3 o'clock, I took a deep breath and opened it. Kevin stood on my porch, looking tired and much older than he had a few months ago. He was holding a small bouquet of grocery store carnations, a pathetic attempt at a peace offering. His smile didn't reach his eyes. They were darting around, unable to meet mine. I didn't invite him in with a hug or a warm welcome. I simply stepped aside and let him pass. He walked into the living room, the same room where he had laid out his charts and lies. The air was thick with unspoken truths. He placed the flowers awkwardly on the coffee table. "These are for you," he said. I just looked at them, then back at him. I didn't thank him. I just sat down in my armchair and waited for him to speak. The power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the doting mother. I was an audience of one, waiting for the performance to begin. He started with nervous small talk, commenting on the weather, asking about the neighbors. I gave him one-word answers. My silence unnerved him. He was used to me filling the gaps, making things comfortable for him. I refused to do it this time. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to get to the reason he was there. He finally cleared his throat, the pretense falling away. "Mom, I need to talk to you about the project," he began, still unable to call it what it was. His house. He was still trying to maintain the fiction of a shared investment. He launched into a long, convoluted story. He talked about unforeseen construction costs, supply chain issues, and a contractor who had supposedly misquoted the job. He painted a picture of himself as a victim, a man struggling against overwhelming odds to build a future for his family. He never once mentioned my money directly, but it was the ghost in the room, the foundation of every lie he was telling. I listened without interrupting, my expression unreadable. Inside, I felt a chilling calm. I was watching a stranger try to deceive me. As he spoke, I studied his face. I saw the fine lines of stress around his eyes, the way he kept running his hand through his hair. He wasn't the powerful, successful son he pretended to be on social media. He was a man in over his head, a man whose greed had outstripped his resources. He had built the shell of a dream house, but he had no way to finish it. He had used up my life savings, and now he was back for more. The realization was not surprising. It was simply the logical next step in his betrayal. He finally got to the point. His voice dropped, taking on a tone of false sincerity. "The thing is, Mom, we're so close. The house is framed, the roof is on, but we're out of funds for the interior work. The bank won't extend our loan." He paused, looking at me as if he expected sympathy. I offered none. I just continued to watch him, my silence a wall he couldn't seem to break through. He was becoming desperate now, the carefully constructed narrative beginning to crumble. Then came the moment that changed everything. He leaned forward, trying to look earnest and caring. "I have an idea," he said, "a solution that will be good for all of us." I held my breath, knowing what was coming next. This was the true purpose of his visit, the reason for the cheap flowers and the sad story. This was the final move in his game. I braced myself for the words, for the ultimate insult that he was about to deliver as if it were a gift. "You should sell this house, Mom," he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "The market is at an all-time high. You'd get a great price for it. It's too big for you anyway. All this upkeep." He was smiling now, as if he had just presented me with a winning lottery ticket. He was so convinced of his own cleverness, so certain of my weakness. He saw my home not as a place of memories, but as a final asset to be liquidated for his benefit. He continued, laying out his grand vision. "You could give us the money from the sale. We could finish our house in style. No more cutting corners. And the best part is, you would come live with us. We're building a beautiful guest suite on the main floor. You'd have your own space, but you'd be right there with us. You could see Liam and Olivia every single day. No more being alone in this big, empty house." He sat back, clearly proud of his proposal, convinced he had just solved all my problems. In that instant, something inside me shifted permanently. Hearing him suggest I sell Arthur's house, our home of 40 years, to finance his luxury lifestyle was the final betrayal. It was more profound than the theft of my money. He wanted to erase my life, my independence, my history, and absorb it into his own. He wasn't offering me a place in his home. He was offering me a cage, a room where the woman he had bankrupted could live out her days under his control. The last remnants of maternal love, of the instinct to protect him, vanished. They were replaced by a cold, hard clarity that was as sharp as broken glass. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, and I saw a parasite. He had fed on my trust, consumed my savings, and now he wanted to consume my home. The sadness that had plagued me for months was gone, burned away by a clean, purifying anger. I finally understood that this was not a misunderstanding or a mistake. It was his character. I felt a strange sense of power. I was no longer the foolish old woman who had been so easily tricked. I was the only person who knew the entire truth. He thought he was in control, that he was manipulating me toward his desired outcome. He had no idea that I had seen the pictures, that I knew about the house, that I understood exactly who he was and what he had done. He was playing chess with a player who could already see the checkmate. His smile began to falter as I remained silent, just looking at him. He was expecting tears, or gratitude, or at least a discussion. He was not prepared for my stillness. "Mom?" he asked, his voice now laced with uncertainty. "What do you think? It's a perfect plan, isn't it?" He was looking for reassurance, for a sign that his manipulation was working. He needed me to be the weak, loving mother he had always counted on. But that woman was gone. In her place was someone new, someone forged in the fire of his betrayal. I felt a lifetime of being a gentle, accommodating person fall away. I had spent my life as a teacher, a wife, a mother, always putting others first. Now, for the first time, I was going to put myself first, not with shouting or with tears, but with a decision that would protect what little I had left and honor the life Arthur and I had built. I finally leaned forward in my chair, mirroring his posture from moments before. I looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time, he didn't look away. He couldn't. He was trapped by my gaze. The air in the room was electric. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to stop. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for my response. I knew that what I said next would change the course of our lives forever. The words formed in my mind, clear and simple. There was no hesitation, no doubt. The path forward was illuminated by the wreckage of my son's deceit. I had been living in a fog of grief and shame, but his greed had been the wind that blew it all away. I was no longer reacting to his actions. I was about to take my own. I was about to build a boundary so strong he would never be able to cross it again. This moment was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the start of me taking back my life. Not the one he had stolen, but a new one. One defined by my own strength and my own rules. He had come here today to take the last thing I had, but he was going to leave with nothing. He was about to learn that the quietest people often have the strongest resolve, and that a mother's love, when betrayed, can transform into an unbreakable shield. I opened my mouth to speak, the first word of my new life ready to be spoken. The shock on his face when he heard it would be the first payment on the debt he owed me. He thought he was closing a deal, securing his future. He had no idea he was about to witness the collapse of his own. The turning point was not his proposal. The turning point was my answer, and I was ready to give it. I took one last look at the desperate, greedy man sitting in front of me, the man who called himself my son. All the pain, all the lonely nights, all the shame, it all coalesced into a single, powerful thought. It was time to teach my son his final lesson, and it was a lesson he would never, ever forget.